And this is the point in our service where we enter into a time of prayerful meditation, or meditative prayer, as you prefer. And my reading to launch this is called The Edge by David O. Rankin. A religion that promises life without tension, a life without conflict, a life without suffering, is a religion of passivity. A religion where mediocrity, a religion of insignificance. Everything we're doing in this world is a desperate gamble, a game of chance where nothing is certain. What is love? Is it not a wild and sublime speculation that can end in ecstasy or despair? What is courage? Is it not a hazardous risk of fortune that can end in victory or defeat? What is adventure? Is it not a blind leap in the dark that can end in joy or disaster? What is faith? Is it not a prayerful flip the coin that can end in heaven or hell? If I refuse to play the game, if I refuse to risk myself, if I refuse to throw the dice, I'm never really alive. I'm then only flesh, baking in the sun on a middling plateau with no view of the valley and no road to the peak. Today, in the sermon, I will be telling you some stories of people who are not afraid to love, who are not afraid to be courageous, who are not afraid to express their faith, and who are not afraid to play the game. Sometimes it's ended well, sometimes not. But in any case, they illustrate some of the challenges and difficulties of what it means to be a Unitarian. And these stories are not ancient ones. They are very close to being contemporary ones. But ours is not an easy religion. Ours may seem easy, our principles may seem straightforward, our principles seem in some ways very middle class and very Canadian. And yet these principles in some parts of the world have been very hard fought and hard to arrive at. I ask you now, during this period of silence that's going to follow, to consider what it means to truly be a Unitarian, and try to imagine to yourselves some of the challenges that our faith has resulted in certain parts of the world. And I'll be giving an update on what's happened with Fulgence in Burundi at the close of my sermon. And now for 2 minutes of silence. I have been asked, why history? What's the point of going back centuries or even decades into a history that we can read about in books that may not be terribly relevant today? Why do we not concentrate on more current issues, and there are certainly enough of those, and talk about our religion today, Unitarianism today, and what it means to be a Unitarian in this day and age, in this country, with present-day challenges? Why go back into the past? Well, aside from my own personal interest in history, I would also argue that to fully understand and appreciate the faith that we have taken on for ourselves, it is necessary to understand how it arose, where it came from, to understand something about the struggles through which many people have come to produce the kind of situation in which we are now live so comfortably in our churches here in North America. We need to understand that. We need to understand also our connections with the larger Unitarian and Universalist world. We are not alone here. We are not alone in this country or in this city. We are not alone on this continent as Unitarians and Universalists. We share a faith that is truly worldwide, a faith that many people have struggled and continue to struggle to uphold today. These are our issues as well. These are our contemporaries today who live in this world with us, who profess our faith and sometimes under grave difficulties and threats to their own lives. The struggles that I described are not merely historical ones in the past, they are contemporary ones at the same time. You all know the story by now, I think, and most of you do, of Michael Servetus, a precursor to the Unitarian movement. who dared to challenge, at the beginning of the Reformation, dared to challenge the notion of the Trinity, and as a result was condemned to death by the Spanish Inquisition, the French Inquisition, and finally burned at the stake in John Calvin's Geneva in the mid-1500s. You also know the story of Norbert Čapek. We often describe that. The Unitarian minister who founded in Czechoslovakia in the late 1920s, the Unitarian movement there, and eventually produced the largest Unitarian church in the world, with well over 3,500 members, only to be arrested by the Gestapo, put into Dachau, and eventually died there in 1942. That story is also familiar to many of you. You may also be familiar, some of you at least, with the story of James Reed, who was clubbed to death in Selma, Alabama, after responding to a call by the Reverend Martin Luther King for a second Selma to Montgomery march. Selma's public hospital refused to treat the Reverend Reed, who was taken to University Hospital in Birmingham, 2 hours away. He died on Thursday, March 11, 1965, with his wife by his side. His death inspired thousands to join King in the successful Third March to Montgomery. So these are stories that you may already be familiar with, maybe not as much with John Reed's. But now I want to share with you some perhaps not so familiar stories. Begin our journey in the Philippines. Toribio Quimada was born in 1917. This was a time after the Spanish-American War when many changes were occurring in Spain, not only in terms of who the new colonial power was, but also reactions to the Spanish Catholic Church, which had been dominant in that country for many years. There was a strong reaction against the Catholicism, the Spanish Catholicism that had been imposed on them. Numerous Protestant churches tried to make their own inroads, but some were native developed, such as the Iglesia Universal de Cristo, United Church of Christ, which was founded in the late 1920s or early 1930s on the island of Negros in the Philippines. Toribio was appointed as minister at that time with this church. He administered to a small number of congregations, about 8 of them in fact, and one of his biggest challenges, because this church was not very well funded, was finding religious materials to use for the religious education classes. There simply were not very much produced in the native language. So he had great difficulty trying to get his hands on these, any kind of materials. So he decided he would do a little bit of investigating, but before that, he received a request to do a marriage one time in one of his churches, and received it wrapped in a newspaper. This particular piece of newspaper happened to give the names of some churches in North America, in the United States in particular. He just happened to unwrap this piece of paper and discovered the name of the Universalist Church in Wisconsin. Ah, Universal. I belong to the Universal Church of Christ. Maybe they have some materials I can use. So he wrote away to them, but never received a reply. Not daunted by this, he decided that he would go after some materials. So he got hold of an almanac, found out the name of another Universalist church, this time in Gloucester, Massachusetts. So he wrote away to the minister of the Universalist church in Gloucester, and this time he received a reply. Not only did he receive a reply, he received a letter of support. He was then put in touch with the National Universalist Association in America, and they in turn began to supply him with materials, all kinds of stuff. He found these immensely helpful. He got them translated, and he started to use them in his congregations. Well, all was going well and good until the Universalist Church of Christ discovered what he was up to. At that point, they told him quite sternly, he could not use these materials. They are not Christian. Well, Toribio decided that he was not going to give up his hard work in establishing this new religious program that he had developed using these materials from overseas. so he refused to do so. The result of that was that he was excommunicated in 1954. Well, but that didn't stop him. He simply decided that he was going to carry on with his preaching, and so he took 8 congregations with him out of the Universal Church of Christ, and instead founded in 1955 the Universalist Church of the Philippines, and became associated then with the UUA on a more formal basis. He had help from the U.S. and from Japan, and he established in 1955, yes, by this time he had 9 congregations he took out with him. Now these congregations are quite different from the Unitarian congregations that we're familiar with here in North America. These were poor, rural farmers and fishermen. Struggling was quite common at this point for him, but with this overseas support he was able to keep going. In 1961, which was the time of the merger of the Universalist and Unitarian congregations in North America, he began to have problems with the post office, because he was now receiving mail addressed to the Unitarian and Universalist Church of the Philippines. But that was not the name of the organization. So the post office was refusing to deliver the mail. For that reason, they decided to change the name of their association, although they were still Universalist in their theology, to the Unitarian and Universalist Church of the Philippines. Now he got the mail. It worked. He was very much interested in social justice. He was very much concerned with the ordinary parishioners in his 9 congregations. Very concerned with their welfare. And around this time now, they began an incursion of multinational corporations into the island of Negros. They wanted to clear the land to plant their plantations of fruits and vegetables to ship back to North America and other places around the world. Now the farmers who lived on Negros did not have proper title to their land. They may have been living there for many generations, but they never had formal title. Theoretically, all these land was owned by the state. So the state, under Marcos, was making these deals with these corporations to take up the land and dispossess the farmers. Toribio worked on their behalf as publicly as he could in their defense. He did not make himself very popular with the government, and soon began receiving death threats from paramilitary groups. These threats became so serious that he felt it necessary to move his family away from where they were living and into a larger center. But he decided he needed to stay on to continue to defend his people, continue to serve as their minister. And on May 23rd, 1988, he was killed. One night, a group of paramilitaries showed up at his home, shot him in the head, and burned the house down so they could pretend that he had died in a house fire. A day or so later, when his family returned, they found his body with a hole in the skull. They knew he had been murdered. But it took many years and a lot of effort to finally get some level of justice for Toribio. Rebecca Kimada Cienz now became president of the UUCP. And today they have 30 congregations with 2,000 plus members, with another congregation forming in Manila. They are a slowly expanding group. So here in one man you have both the miracle, finding universalism through a newspaper that was used as a wrapping for a wedding invitation, to becoming a martyr for his beliefs and his work. That was not so very long ago. I should also point out, by the way, concerning these churches in the Philippines, they have now 34 ministers, mostly trained in the Divinity School of Silman University in Demagogi City. One of the unique characteristics of what they do, and have done from the beginning, is faith healing. It's their principal evangelization strategy, as a matter of fact. From a UUA visitor to the Philippines, and I quote, The biggest draw for gaining new members to the UUCP has been their faith healing ministry. Amazingly, UU faith healers have an incredible success curing chronic and supposedly terminal illnesses. Their faith healing association is an honest and upstanding organization. Their proof is their high success rate and the fact that they accept no money for their services. These men and women are some of the most selfless and dedicated people I have ever encountered. Sometimes they incorporate the faith healing directly into their services. At other times they are done following the service. And people may travel for 2 or 3 hours walking to get to some of these churches. They are one very dedicated group of Unitarians, and mostly Universalists there. Another bit of miracle. Would you really walk 2 hours to get here on a Sunday morning and walk home again afterwards? We now shift location to India. Hajam Kishore Singh, 1887, and the Kasai Hills in the northeast corner of India. This corner of India was neither Hindu nor Muslim. It was animist. These were the hill tribes, uncivilized, uneducated, fertile ground for Protestant ministers during the evangelization bit in India, particularly the Presbyterians. They did a lot of good work, actually. They provided educational opportunities for people. They provided access to materials and to supplies that the locals never had. And they found quite a bit of success in converting the natives from their animist beliefs into their Presbyterian faith. But Hasjon, who was one of these educated tribal people, began and actually actively involved in the church, providing materials and teaching in terms of education, began questioning what he was taught. He began questioning such things, began questioning some of the Presbyterian doctrines and beliefs. He began having his real doubts as to whether or not these were fully accurate. But he thought for a long time that he was alone. He had no one to talk to. Until he was put in touch with Reverend Dahl, then in Calcutta, an American, who supplied him some materials, which later helped to put him in contact with Boston and with London, with the Unitarian associations in those countries. He acquired a missionary zeal for the Unitarian faith. He preached the faith, walking all over the hills in the Kasai area, establishing eventually many local congregations. But this was a slow process, and for years he only had a very small group of people, with mostly family members. He did establish twice small churches, but they were burned down by the local Presbyterians who weren't too happy about his being there. And of course they considered him to be a total apostate, which I guess he was. So very small numbers at first, but he kept at it for a long time. Now, in that part of India, there are 9,000 Unitarians in 32 congregations and 5 fellowships. They are extremely active. I've heard reports of their annual meetings, which involves literally thousands of them showing up with their trucks with boom boxes, blasting out Unitarian hymns all over the village. And with many of the villages putting lights on top of their houses to symbolize the flame. They've gone a long way, and they're very active. They have no hesitation in proselytizing. They want to spread their faith. A bit of a miracle there. But they were not the only Unitarians, and they're not even the first Unitarians in India. That honor goes to a small group of Unitarians who make up the Unitarian Christian Church of Chennai, used to be called Madras. It was founded by a native Indian who was a slave. He was a slave of an English owner. And he lived for a long time with his owner in London. His owner was a Unitarian. We're talking about the late 1700s here. He must have done good work, and he certainly was inspired by the faith of his master, because upon his master's death, he was freed, and obviously given enough resources to get himself back to India again, back to what was then Madras, where he founded the first church, Unitarian Christian Church of Madras at that time, in 1795. That church still exists, all by itself. It has 225 members, a large church school with numerous teachers. They provide a night school for training women in sewing and tailoring so they can be independent. They run a village school at a village about 3 hours away from Chennai for untouchables. And if it weren't for them, these children would have had no education at all. They are partnered with Unitarian churches in Edinburgh and Glasgow. And Joy and I have visited both of those churches. They're fairly small, but extremely welcoming, I might add. But they have been providing financial and material support for this little congregation in Chennai ever since. A bit of a miracle there, too. Moving on once more, still in the Far East. A short story this time. Of Indonesia. When I was on the ICUU, the International Council of Unitarians and Universalists, as an executive committee member, we received some correspondence from a group in Indonesia saying they are in fact a Unitarian group and would like to join the ICUU. We'd never heard of them before. So we invited two of them to come to one of our meetings, which they did. We were quite impressed. And then we sent a representative from our executive committee down there to do a proper investigation to see if they were for real. Turns out they were. They really are quite Unitarian. What's unique about these, we're talking about 8 congregations in the Philippines, in Indonesia, is that they were former Seventh-day Adventists, all of them. But they found the Unitarian faith to be a lot more amenable to what they in fact really believed. They are now members of the ICUU. They were created officially in the year 2000, de facto since 1996, and together they call themselves Jemaat Allah Global Indonesia, the Indonesian Global Church of God. That's what they call themselves. They meet every Saturday on the Sabbath, so a carryover from the Seventh-day Adventist days. And they are also quite unique in that they have built very good relationships with the local Muslim groups and imams. They have very good terms with the local Muslims. Probably because they share the Unitarian belief in the belief that God is one. And now back again, another shift of scene. This time back to the Czech Republic again, but not to Norbert Čapek. Now I have said this, I may have described this story to some of you before, so I'll go through it fairly quickly. The story of Eva Kochmanova and her sons. I met Eva when I was in Prague for the first time. She was working for the Unitarian National Organization at that point as administrator, and she took me on a tour of parts of Old Prague, including Wenceslas Square, which is actually widened to the street. That square was where the big demonstrations occurred during the Velvet Revolution, which brought down the communist regime. She was totally involved in that. But before the revolution broke out, she and a young friend, this was in around 1989, 89, was traveling home from work one day, and they go across the top of the square because there's a metro station there, and a big museum just behind it. And they noticed that there was a student demonstration coming up the street, the anti-government student demonstration. Now they had permission from the government, but only to proceed so far. They didn't want them coming up to the top of the square. There's a big statue of a Czech hero there. They didn't want them railing around that statue. And also, the Communist Parliament was located nearby. They didn't want them anywhere near there either. But the students would not stop where they were told to stop. But Eva noticed something else. She noticed that in the side streets in the square, there were police, riot squad members in full riot gear. They were standing there waiting. And sure enough, when the students passed that point, the police charged them with their clubs and their nightsticks and began to beat up the students. And there were several spectators watching from the top of the square besides Eva. She said to her 16-year-old companion, "We're going to leave the square now, but whatever you do, don't run, because they will take off after anybody who runs when they are done with the students." And sure enough, when the police were done with the students, they turned on the spectators. In particular, anybody who ran. They would take off after them. Eva and her young friend were able to walk through the police lines and make their escape in the square. But that was not all. Eva was also anxious to spread the word of what was happening in Prague. And she and a group of friends were working a clandestine press. This was a time when the Czech government still had tight control over all the media in the Czech Republic. Nothing what was happening in Prague was getting out into the countryside. They controlled the radio, the TV stations, the newspapers, the magazines, everything. Nothing could get out. But they were determined, with a small group involving Eva and others, were determined to get the word out. So they began running off on their secret press some flyers to get them out into the country and secretly distributing them around Czechoslovakia. Now, Eva, at this time, had 2 sons in the Czech military. Because they were conscripted. Everybody had to serve in the military after high school. One of these sons was in his barracks in the canteen, and he got one of these posters and was putting it up on the company bulletin board. This is the Czech military we're talking about. When an officer walked in and ordered him to take it down, he refused. And contrary to what anybody might have expected, the officer simply turned around and walked away. That was a pretty daring thing for him to do. You consider it might have, even in our own military, if someone had put up something that an officer didn't like on the bulletin board and refused to take it down, one can only imagine what might have happened to him. Quite imagine what it might have been in a communist country like the Czech Republic. One can only speculate that this officer knew what was coming. He knew that the tide was turning, and there's no way the Czech military was going to back the government against its own people. And sure enough, shortly after this period of time, the revolution began. It was a peaceful revolution. Thousands, tens of thousands of people began to appear in Wenceslas Square. You may have heard of this at the time, 1989. Eva was one of them. She was there along with thousands of others, night after night after night. She showed me the balcony where they had speakers up, encouraging the people in their quiet revolution. By this time, the press was in full support. The press was there from all over the world. The government could do nothing to suppress it. At one point, they said to the people, well, we'll form a coalition government. How about that? And the crowd turned them down flat. 3 days later, the government fell. And that was the end of communism in the Czech Republic, in Czechoslovakia. She said to me, you know, we knew we were going to win. We were not going to stop coming until the government was gone. We absolutely knew we were going to win. And they did. So while she was not a martyr, nor was her son in this case, they could have been. And that's not so very long ago. And now on to Burundi. You heard the story, many of you here, about what's been happening there, and I'll give you a quick update on that. The first thing we heard was around December 19th, an update from the ICUU on the Burundi situation as it existed at that point. Violence in Burundi has escalated with government forces killing civilians, leaving the bodies in the streets to further terrorize the people. The still active charges against the leader of the Burundi Unitarians are now being used to seek the arrest and intimidate the lawyers and those of other faiths who were of assistance. Regrettably, it is now necessary for Burundi Unitarians to join the multitudes fleeing the country. And now, a bit later than that, this was a year-end message for the Unitarian Church of Bujumbura, Burundi, and to the Tudabari Foundation. Dear friends, colleagues, and supporters, the year comes to a close. This is this past Christmas. We think and reflect on how it went and what events characterize it. From my perspective, this year was both sweet and bitter. This year was sweet. We continued to build a beloved community through our witness, our unconditional presence in the impoverished area of Bujumbura through our open door policy. The church, through the Tudabari Foundation, responded to the needs of the community and church members. This year was sweet. We continued to share and expose our ideals of a better world. We continued to hope, sometimes against hope, that there's a better way, a better world. We continue to receive and give opportunities of growth for us to be where we need to be as individuals, as a community, and as a church. We continue to hold regular church services. This year was sweet because you were around. You gave us encouragement to keep going. You covered us with the warmth of your love. You were generous to us. You sacrificed yourself on our behalf. And yes, this year was bitter too. Starting from April 26th, massive street demonstrations were organized. We feared for our lives. Many lives were taken. Church members were threatened. Some left the city for rural areas, and others took part in the demonstrations against the controversial third term. The president of Burundi was trying to be elected for a third term, which was against the Constitution. It was running into enormous resistance in Burundi. It began to take on aspects of a tribal conflict, shades of Rwanda coming up. And the struggle's still going on, I might add. This year was bitter. The church minister was kidnapped at gunpoint and his life threatened. After the kidnapping, he was arrested, accused of co-plotting to kill high-ranking politicians. When this charge was dropped, another one was forged and consisted of money laundering, illegal financial activities, and funding of criminals. This last charge is not dropped. The church, Tudabari, and the minister's personal bank accounts were and are still frozen. This year was bitter. Many church members were threatened and had to leave the country. Now, Fulgence, the name of the minister concerned here in all this, preached from this very pulpit. You might recall that earlier on. And he was the one arrested. But now some better news. Specific details are best not aired in the social media, but we do want to share these with you as a general update on the situation. We are delighted to report that the Reverend Fulgence Nakajamana is no longer in police custody in Burundi and has traveled to another country. Thank you all for the letters, petitions, interventions, social media postings, prayers, donations that you have been making and sharing regardless of persecution of Unitarians in Burundi, and in particular, the imprisonment of Reverend Fulgence. The conclusion to all this is that even today, in places, it is not easy being a Unitarian. Not in the past, and not in the present. It is a challenge to live out our faith sometimes, particularly in the places in Africa where the Unitarians have taken on the position of defending the rights of gay and lesbians, sometimes in countries where it is not only illegal, but can carry the death penalty. That takes courage. It takes courage, and it's one of the reasons why the Unitarians are so heavily persecuted in some places. And yet Africa as a whole is a major area for Unitarian growth these days. And not just in Burundi, but in other places in Africa at the same time. So there's both encouragement and concern for our fellow believers in some parts of the world. The threats do not go away. I'll give you another example of something very recent. And you may have heard this story in the press. I don't think we preached it here. If I can find it here. Yes, here it is. On July 27th, 2008, the Tennessee Valley Unitarian Universalist Church in Knoxville, Tennessee, while hosting a youth performance of Annie Jr., with some 200 people watching, and 25 children performing, when a gunman, Jim David Atkinson, entered the church and opened fire with a shotgun at members of the congregation. 60-year-old Greg McKendry, a longtime church member and usher, who deliberately stood in front of the gunman to protect others, was killed at the scene. A 61-year-old woman, Linda Krager, died from wounds suffered during the attack later that night. Krager was a member of Westside Unitarian Universalist Church in Farragut. 7 other attendees were wounded. The shooter was motivated by a desire to kill liberals and Democrats because they were ruining the country, in his view. A former wife of his was a member of this congregation. He was subsequently caught, tried, convicted, and is now in prison where he will be for life without parole. Yes, to be a Unitarian in places can still be a dangerous thing. There are fanatics everywhere, and it gets really scary when they are government-supported fanatics. Not here, but certainly in Rwanda, in Burundi, I'm sorry. So our faith is not an easy faith to follow. But it's important that we be aware of these stories, to be aware that our very comfortable faith here on the North Shore and here in Canada has been arrived at through a great deal of pain and suffering, and sometimes the sacrifice of human life. But at the same time, it has its miracles. It has succeeded despite all attempts to suppress us. We have our miracles, as in the Philippines, where we have our miracles as in Indonesia, we have our miracles elsewhere in Africa, where our faith is growing, and in India, where faith is thriving, where we are succeeding. We are providing a basis for liberal thought, for openness of belief, for concern for humankind, and for our sincere belief in the wealth and dignity of every person. Thank you.